Welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of major developments in North Carolina politics and public policy. I'm Mitch Kokai, sitting in this week for Donna King, and I am joined by a great cast of characters, we can call them characters, from the Carolina Journal staff, all great reporters. Sitting to my right and to your left on the screen, Brianna Kramer, who is a public policy reporter for Carolina Journal. Joining us on the other orange couch, we have Katie Zender, who is a public policy reporter at Carolina Journal, and the deputy editor at CJ, Jeff Moore. Each of them is going to be talking about a major story that they worked on during the past week. But before we get to that, we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the big headlines in North Carolina politics and policy over the past week. The first one, another trip to North Carolina from President Biden, Vice President Harris. We see them targeting North Carolina. They were talking about the anniversary of the Affordable Care Act. First, I have to ask, was anyone caught in the traffic? We know that any time that the president or vice president comes to town, there's always some sort of traffic shutdown. Was anyone slowed down by that?
Thankfully not. I made sure to get out of downtown Raleigh early before he arrived.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, I had a nice prescient warning from my wife about what she saw on the map for I-40 going east, and so I avoided that area. It's always a zoo when you have a president coming into town.
Jeff, I have to ask you, as someone who's been working on these things, a presidential visit, you've seen it from the other side. Mm-hmm. That's got to be a headache for a lot of the people who are not there, actually part of the team.
Yeah, it's a huge operation. Obviously, when you have a president coming to town, you have Secret Service that comes in lead to make sure everything's okay, and you have everything locked down as far as logistics. And so it tends to disrupt much more than just the actual venue that they're at. And leads to a lot of kind of knock-on effects for the local town and whatever commerce and activities is going on, school releases and travel plans and what have you. So it's definitely a headache for everybody else involved. But with the Biden administration, many things are a headache. So it's nothing new there.
I have to ask our relative newcomers to North Carolina, both Katie and Brianna, does it surprise you, being relative newcomers to the Tar Heel state, to see this state getting such attention from the presidential candidates, Katie?
Yeah, it kind of does. North Carolina has never been on really my radar politically. Like, I followed politics for a long time, and there's nothing that I ever noticed that really was special or unique about North Carolina. Yeah, well,
they like coming here.
Yeah, they sure do. Like several times. I think Kamala Harris was here at the beginning of March, too. And Trump has already been coming here several times, and we can expect that to continue all the way through November.
That's right, and if both parties think of this as a major prize, we'll see a lot of them.
Yes.
Biden, Trump, Harris, whoever Trump decides is going to be the person to run with him, plus all of the surrogates for the Biden administration. All right, let's move to the next headline. This is also dealing with the elections and the political parties. The state Republican Party now has a new chair. Its executive director, Jason Simmons, elevated to that post after Michael Whatley became the chair of the Republican National Committee. I have to ask Jeff, as someone who has worked in that organization before, what's the significance of the party chairman? What does that person do?
Yeah, so they are the primary cheerleader and face and voice of the North Carolina Republican Party as far as electing more Republicans across the state. They're employed in raising money for the party to distribute among the election and get out the vote efforts for candidates in the general election, and instrumental in leading the operations. They have an executive director that is more of an operations person, which is the role that Jason Simmons was serving in. But in his elevation to chair, then that kind of gets into the more strategy of how they approach the general election. I think all those things are probably pretty well in place, considering that we're only months away from the general election now. But his elevation to that role, with an endorsement from President Trump, and the former chairman's elevation to chair of RNC with the endorsement of President Trump, speaks to what we were just referring to as North Carolina being more and more elevated on the national scene politically, kind of serving as a model for the GOP and Republicans across the nation, and having a lot of success here in elections. They'd like to pull that success up towards the national stage and then not lose any of the momentum they had on the statewide scene. So Mr. Simmons' elevation to chair there should be continuity as far as leadership in the NC GOP.
And this was a contested race. We saw that there were initially 2 other candidates, one of whom dropped out, but Jim Womack, who I guess was nominated by our state treasurer, Dale Falwell, who had just run for governor. Anything that Republicans should be worried about, the fact that there was some division on who should be the new chair?
And I think it's par for the course that when you have bodies this large with this many different factions, you're going to have different opinions on leadership and everything, and so you never have a full level of 100% support in anything. We don't have election results where you have 100% support on one side or the other.
Or not Russia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or 97% or whatever those elections go. But it's the same way for the executive committee of the Republican Party. I'm sure with the Democratic Party, there are divisions within these organizations as far as just who they want to support. But you see a strong majority supporting Jason Simmons there, so I believe that they're going to have the momentum to be able to repair any relationships or anything that were damaged during the process of running and competing for the chairmanship, and be able to focus on the general election in November.
If I remember correctly, something like 290 out of 420 votes going to him. So yes, a big majority. Let's move to the last headline. Primary elections took place on March 5th, and now the results from those primaries are in fact official. The State Board of Elections saying that those elections have been certified. One key piece that we should note is that Michael Ray, who was a sitting state representative, a Democrat, who did not like the fact that he had lost in a very close election and was challenging some of the results, ended up saying, okay, I'm going to abide by the recounts that were done. He is now officially out. We have only left on the table for the primary a couple of statewide Republican primaries for state auditor and lieutenant governor, and then in the 13th district, a congressional primary. So that'll be very interesting to see. Well, now it's time for us to turn to the topics for which we brought you on board, the big stories you've been working on this week. One of them deals with an issue that was the major headline during much of North Carolina's state budget debate last year, and that was NCInnovation, this major project involving hundreds of millions of dollars for taxpayers to support commercializing university research. Jeff, you've been doing a deep dive into NCInnovation for a while now. What did you find this week?
Yeah, so this week we had made a public records request of the organization to see what they may be discussing as far as the accounting practices, the mandates that are in the state law that enable them to get these hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars, and if they're going to comply with all of the mandates and stipulations in that law to get the next tranche of money. $500 million total is delivered in two $250 million tranches. They've received one, and to get that, they had to be certified that they were following everything. But in our public records request, we discovered some exchanges between board members that were questioning some of the accounting practices at NCInnovation. And actually, one of the board members made an official request of the state auditor's office to audit the organization and make sure that they were counting certain income in appropriate ways. One part of the law requires them to raise $25 million in private capital. Often when you're raising private money, you have pledges that come in. Someone that promises to give either some now and some later, or promises to give based on some stipulation that they have, a restriction. So there are certain ways that in different accounting practices you're supposed to count that as income or not. It looks like the NCInnovation is a little bit iffy on how it's treating some of the private donations and those pledges, treating them as income when maybe that income is not actually in-house. And so one of their board members, actual founder of the Pope Foundation, Art Pope, who's appointed by the General Assembly, went to a board meeting on February 14th where they discussed these items, and he had been requesting information for weeks prior to that, and was unable to get satisfactory answers, apparently, because it looks like during that day he made an official request from the state auditor's office to audit the organization, make sure that they are following the law, in hopes that everything is going to be done correctly, because we have a lot of taxpayer money at stake here. The organization is dedicated to providing grants to help commercialize the research at a few hub UNC colleges, research institutions, to try and get that to a commercialization phase. But it's something that we have to spend a lot of time looking at, because it's a lot of taxpayer money. $500 million is a very large amount. It's not something that was focused on at large across the state while we focused on other things. So we found a lot of kind of juicy, interesting things this week in our records request, and hope to keep shining the light on NC Innovation and make sure those taxpayer dollars are spent appropriately.
Yeah, definitely a good thing for Carolina Journal to be doing. Brianna, you're going to be spending a lot of your time at the General Assembly as they come back into town, and one of the big things they'll be working on is the budget. Are you already preparing your what about NC Innovation questions?
Absolutely. I mean, funding is an important issue, and this year it's a short session, and so funding and the budget is the main priority that they're going to be focused on. And so where that money is going and transparency when it comes to taxpayer dollars is extremely important. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that as they start next month.
You and Jeff will have to coordinate on how these are the things to find out about NC Innovation when they're talking about it. We're going to switch gears a little bit, but remain with the budget, because one of the big things, Katie, you've been working on is shining a light on something that a lot of people don't know about our budget. When we talk about North Carolina's state budget, we talk often about it being $30 billion, but that's not really the whole story. You talked in this story that appeared at CarolinaJournal.com this week about reserve funds. Tell us about it.
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct, Mitch. The $30 billion is not totally accurate. There's an additional $7 billion that are appropriated in what's called reserve funds, and these are kept off the budget. So reserve funds are not a new concept. They're generally standard procedure when it comes to the budget, but since 2020, 20 new reserve funds have been added. Yes. So when we look at some of these reserve funds, we want to look at some of the specific ones, and some of these are very legitimate, such as the Rainy Day Fund, which currently holds about $4.775 billion, which is way above what the Office of State Budget and Management estimated is needed for some kind of economic downturn. So the General Assembly is not putting a ton of extra money into this rainy day fund because there's already so much above budget.
And for those who are kind of new to this story, it's not too long ago that we had an empty rainy day fund. Yeah. We didn't, if there was a rainy day like a hurricane or some big budget problem, we had nothing in that fund. So this has been something that the Republican General Assembly has really done a lot to build up. But it's good to know they don't have to throw a whole lot more in there right now.
Right, exactly. And then one of the other ones is actually NC Innovation. It's a reserve fund, which, Jeff, you pretty much already covered everything I was going to say about this. $500 million in two $250 million payments. It's used to fund research and commercialization. But yeah, that's one of the reserve funds as well. One of our concerns with this is the lack of transparency on reserve funding. It's hard to track how this money is being spent after it's appropriated. It has to be appropriated before it's spent, and the GA has to pass legislation to appropriate it. And then I spoke with Brian Balfour, our VP of Research at the Locke Foundation. One of his biggest concerns is this is very misleading in the way that it's presented to the public because it's artificially lowering the general fund, and so it's making it look like we're spending less money than we actually are. And so again, some of these reserve funds are very legitimate, such as the Rainy Day Fund or the Clean Water Fund. There are others, however, that seem a little bit more frivolous, and it's like, is this really how we should be spending taxpayer dollars? One of these, and this is one of Brian's favorites, is the World University Games Reserve. So in 2029, NC is set to host a biannual sports competition, which is apparently is called the World University Games. And so they're starting to set aside money for that. But is this really how we should be spending our taxpayer dollars, is subsidizing this sports competition? And then there are some other reserve funds that seem to be very redundant, and the only difference is who controls them, such as State Emergency Response and Disaster Relief, which is controlled by the governor. But then we have Earthquake Disaster Recovery Reserve, which is controlled either by the GA or the Director of the Budget. And then again, there's the Hurricane Florence Disaster Recovery, controlled by the Director of the Budget. So the GA could be making budget modifications in the upcoming short session, which could, lessen or expand some of the appropriations that some of these funds are receiving. But we're definitely going to be keeping an eye on this, following this story, and shining a light on this, and holding lawmakers accountable for how they're spending taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, and you mentioned the World University Games. Whether you think that's a good use of taxpayer dollars or not, it could be on budget. I mean, they could just say,
exactly,
we're gonna give X amount of money for these university games, and everyone would know. It would be on the budget. It would be factored into the calculation of how much our budget increase is. You referenced this, but this is an important point. One of the things that we've heard from lawmakers, especially since the Republicans took over control of the General Assembly back in 2011, was keeping budget spending increases at a sustainable level and below the level of inflation plus population growth. All of that money that's going into reserve funds doesn't count in that.
Right.
So they can throw a whole lot more money out there and say, well, we're keeping spending growth low, but on this, in this reserve fund, it's an issue.
And this isn't the first year that they've done this. I think the reserve funds have gone up since about 2020. So they've been doing this for the last 2 or 3 budget cycles.
Yeah, and once again, I'm going to look over at Brianna. This is going to be something I'm sure you're keeping your eye on as they talk about the budget.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to know where exactly that money is going to. I mean, it's taxpayer funds at the end of the day, and so it's important that the people that these elected representatives are supposed to be advocating for are being transparent and honest.
Yeah, transparency, Jeff, I know that's something that's big with you. You were talking about it with NCInnovation and with the reserve funds.
Yeah, and especially with that calculation of population growth plus inflation, to be able to keep under that number is a lot easier if you can move $7 billion off of the official budget and out of that equation. I think this may be a scenario where it's a kind of a consequence of our own success fiscally over these last 10 years. Republican majorities since 2011 have been, they were moved from a situation where we were indebted by billions to the federal government to paying off that debt and having perennial revenue surpluses. And so with all of that success in tax collection, a growing economy, a growing state, you have a lot more opportunity to kind of move money around. There's not necessarily the amount of scrutiny on every dollar that there would be if you were pinching pennies to make sure that you were going to be able to balance a budget or whatnot. So with our state doing so well and so many tax revenues coming in, there's just way more opportunity for them to move the money around. So, but we look to turn the heat up again on the General Assembly and legislators to make sure that even with all of this fiscal success and the kind of flush position that we're in, we're wisely treating taxpayer dollars and maybe most appropriately giving money back to taxpayers whenever possible through future tax decreases on businesses and individuals.
Yeah, something important to keep in mind. Now, the General Assembly comes back to town officially next month for the short session, which hopefully will be short and will wrap up around the 4th of July if possible. But they're already meeting in some committees, and you had a chance, Brianna, to watch and report on a committee that was dealing with the carbon plan that's coming. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so just this week, actually, the Energy Committee met to review the progress of the carbon plan. So that is legislation that was enacted in 2021, as I'm sure you know, and it really calls for 70% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 for public utilities here in North Carolina. And then they also call for carbon neutrality by the year 2050 here in North Carolina. So they met to kind of oversee the progress, implementation of it, hear from experts, and Duke Energy is kind of at the forefront of transitioning to the green energy here. And so they are working towards that and kind of canceling out the coal plants, and they just announced actually plans to create a natural gas plant in place of a coal plant. And then they're also working to develop offshore wind farms as well. Duke Energy leases an area of land from the federal government off the shore of North Carolina. So that's something that they're working to kind of maximize the tax incentives in the years ahead. So we know there's lots of funding from the federal government, and the Inflation Reduction Act brought a lot of the green funding and tax incentives. But at the state level, as you mentioned, I come from out of state, and so it's so interesting to know that Republicans passed this green agenda in 2021, Republican majority. And so that's for the carbon neutrality over the next 20, 30 years. But a study from Northwood University that just came out ranks all the different energy sources and how they line up. And number one, in terms of affordability and reliability,
Let me guess. Nuclear?
Close.
Oh, okay.
Natural gas, actually.
All right.
Yeah, so they gave that an A rating. And then 2, nuclear. They gave that a B+. But on the other end of the spectrum, 2 Fs in the lineup here, and those were solar and wind. So I think, Katie, you mentioned that in the agriculture realm, they kind of are concerned or have some preferences on.
Yeah. So Agriculture Commissioner Steve Troxler has actually talked about how the agriculture world needs more energy and we need reliable, sustainable energy. And I wasn't here for this, but maybe some of you remember this. In 2022, around Christmas time, Duke Energy actually instituted rolling blackouts to reserve energy. But going back to what agriculture prefers, Steve Troxler has said that, you know, as you mentioned, solar is very poor for reliability and sustainability, gets an F. And then natural gas is the best form of sustainable, reliable energy. So they would prefer natural gas, or nuclear is the next best option, as you mentioned again. But I think that agriculture does have some concerns with nuclear package plants.
Back to the meeting, you mentioned that some might find it surprising that Republicans passed this legislation. One of the key pieces that I know that the proponents of that bill say is, hey, we said that as this transition takes place, it's got to be least cost, reliable energy, and you have to make sure that the electric grid is protected and strengthened. And so that was one of the ways to get around just trying to put as much solar and wind on there as possible. Did you hear much discussion of that from the committee?
Yes, they did emphasize that during the meeting, that it does come down to affordability, least cost for the customer also, and reliability. So they're definitely sticking to that and want that for customers. But at the same time, as you cancel out older plants, it's just a rising cost. When you're bringing in all new resources. You just a couple months ago we saw Duke raise their prices, and then their forecasts even show that demand is actually going to go up. So they had to modify their plans for the years ahead because they're expecting, with population growth and more businesses coming to North Carolina, that there's actually going to be a growing demand for power here, which is a good thing. But they had to modify their plan and how they're going to transition to cleaner energy sources. So that's why they're also sticking with natural gas, which is more reliable.
And you're going to be working on this issue, I'm sure, for months and probably years to come.
Yes.
Jeff, any thoughts about the rising bills of electricity?
Well, this is the tricky balance between having a dual mandate of the affordability, reliability function, and then the emissions reduction function. So if you're going to put aggressive goals out there, 70% reductions by 2030, complete carbon neutrality by 2050, you can't necessarily hamstring some of your efforts to provide that affordable, reliable energy. But as you mentioned, there is an emphasis on the affordable and reliable function. The leader of this committee, I believe, is Senator Paul Newton, who's a former executive at Duke Energy, understands very much the importance of reliability and affordability. No one wants to repeat the rolling blackouts on a very cold Christmas Eve that we had just a little over a year ago. So yeah, as we move forward and hold up some of these goals, we need to make sure that the goals are actually compatible with economic growth and livelihoods in North Carolina. So I appreciate the focus on reliability and affordability first and foremost.
That is a story that you can find at carolinajournal.com. The byline is from Brianna Kramer. We also heard about stories written by Katie Zender and Jeff Moore. You can find all of that and more at carolinajournal.com. That's all the time we have for this week on the Debrief. We hope that you will like, subscribe, do all those social media things that will ensure that a number of people get to see this. And please join us again next week for another edition of the Debrief.